On my wedding day, my vicious mother-in-law humiliated me in front of my entire family. You're just a gardener's daughter. My son could have anyone of his own status, not a nobody like you. A gold digger who doesn't belong in our world, she told me mockingly. But she never imagined that months later, Camilla adjusted the simple pleats of her wedding dress. Her hands trembled as she looked at herself in the mirror of the small church room where they had left her to get ready. The white fabric was soft, but it wasn't silk or any kind of luxury. It was a dress her mother had sewn with dedication and love. This is enough, she told herself over and over. But deep down, the weight of the difference between her world and Elias's was crushing her heart. She couldn't help but remember the looks of disdain she had received from his family over the past few months. Her father, Julian, a strong man with hands hardened by years of working the earth, peered in at the door with a proud smile, but his eyes showed a slight concern. "You look beautiful, my daughter," he said, entering slowly so as not to wrinkle his shirt, which was a bit worn but clean. Camilla smiled weakly at him, grateful for his attempt to make her feel secure. She knew her father had done everything possible to support her, even with all the doubts he also had. But how could she feel secure when Elias's parents, sitting among the guests outside, didn't accept her? Her love for Elias was undeniable, but the reality they faced weighed on her more and more. "Thank you, Dad," she replied, taking his hand affectionately. "But I can't stop thinking about what's about to happen out there." Julian sighed, moving closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. "The only thing that matters is that you two love each other. Everything else you'll figure out together." Camilla felt his comfort, but she couldn't help but think of the biting words that Charles and Susan, Elias's parents, had thrown at her more than once. "She's just the gardener's daughter," Susan had said, as if it were a sentence. "He could have anyone, someone of his status," the family's friends would murmur. But Elias had never wavered. He always defended her, always chose her. That kept her strong, even as the voices of disdain echoed in her head. The sound of the guests starting to settle outside the church let her know the moment was near. Her heart was beating fast, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Julian, sensing his daughter's nervousness, squeezed her hand one last time. "Elias loves you. That's all that matters today." Camilla smiled, her eyes moist with emotion, and nodded. She knew it was true, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the stares she would feel on her as soon as she crossed those doors. Outside, Elias was standing at the altar, trying not to show his own anxiety. He knew what was coming. He knew what his parents had prepared, especially his father, Charles, who had been clear with him in private. "If you marry that girl," Charles had said, his voice deep and controlled, "you'll be signing your way out of this family. You'll be disinherited, Elias. There will be no turning back." The warning still echoed in his head. Susan, his mother, more diplomatic but equally calculating, had tried to dissuade him more subtly. "Elias, you can have everything you've ever dreamed of," she had told him softly. "But with her, it will be a difficult life. She's not on your level. She doesn't understand our world. Don't let this mistake ruin your future." Elias, however, could not be swayed. He loved Camilla and knew that what they shared was genuine, far more genuine than any superficial relationship his family would have wanted for him. He knew that money and power could not replace what he felt for her. Even so, the pressure from his family hounded him like a shadow. When the church doors opened and Camilla appeared in the doorway, all those thoughts vanished. Elias saw her, and nothing else mattered. She was his anchor, the reason he was willing to defy everything. Camilla walked slowly toward him. The shine of tears in her eyes reflected the mix of emotions they both shared. In the front row, Charles looked at his son with coldness. Susan, with a look of resignation, held her head high, but her disdain for the bride was obvious to everyone around her. Camilla felt her steps were heavy, but when her eyes met Elias's, something inside her calmed. There he was, her refuge. Their love was so palpable that she could almost forget the people who were looking at her with judgments disguised as polite smiles. When she reached the altar, Elias took her hands in his, squeezing them gently. "We're in this together, Camilla," he whispered to her. She nodded, barely holding back her tears. She knew that what came next wouldn't be easy. The priest began with the formalities, but before the crucial moment of the vows arrived, Charles stood up from his seat. The whispers among the guests intensified. Elias frowned, knowing his father wasn't going to miss the opportunity to make his final statement. "Forgive me, Father," Charles said, interrupting the rhythm of the ceremony, "but I believe I have something to say before we proceed." The priest, confused, paused and looked at Elias for a signal, but Charles didn't wait for a response. He addressed the guests, his voice clear and authoritative. As the father of the groom, I feel it is my duty to make sure everyone here understands what is happening today. Camilla felt the weight of every one of Charles's words like a direct blow to her stomach. Elias tensed, ready to intervene, but Charles continued. Today, my son Elias is going to marry Camilla, the gardener's daughter. I'm not here to insult anyone, but to make clear what this means for our family. Elias has decided to ignore everything we have done for him, everything we have built together as a family, to marry a woman who is clearly not his equal. The murmurs among the guests grew as glances turned to Camilla, some sympathetic, others full of judgment. Camilla felt the air leave her chest, but before she could react, Elias let go of her hands and took a step forward. "Dad, stop," Elias said, his voice firm and filled with contained anger. Charles didn't seem affected by his son's words. He looked at him with a coldness that only those closest to him knew. "I'm sorry, son, but if you choose to go through with this, you will be giving up your inheritance, your place in the family, everything. There will be no turning back." The room went silent. The guests held their breath, waiting for Elias's response. Everyone knew this moment would change everything. Elias stood motionless in front of his father, feeling the weight of his words fall on him with overwhelming force. The hall, which had been full of whispers and glances, now seemed like an unfathomable void where only Charles's words resonated. "You will give up everything." Camilla, by his side, watched him with her heart in her throat, her eyes shining with uncertainty, waiting for him to look at her, to reassure her in some way. But at that moment, all Elias could feel was a mix of rage and pain. Charles, still standing, watched his son with a cold, calculating gaze, as if he wanted to remind him who had the power in that room. But what he didn't understand was that Elias had made a decision long before this day. "Dad," Elias finally said, his voice low but firm. "I know what this means to you. I know what you expected from me, what you always wanted me to do. But this is my life, and I am choosing Camilla because I love her, because I know that with her, I can be happy." Charles frowned, as if those words held no value for him. "Love, you say?" His voice was loaded with disdain. "Elias, love doesn't fill bank accounts, it doesn't open doors, it doesn't give you the respect you need to keep building an empire. Do you really believe that with her by your side you can have the future we have prepared for you?" Susan, Elias's mother, remained seated, watching the scene with a look of resignation, but not without a small spark of sadness. She knew there was no turning back, and even though she wanted her son to make a decision that would benefit the family, she couldn't help but feel the pain that all of this was causing. "Charles, please," Susan whispered, trying to soften the atmosphere. "This is not the time for this." But Charles didn't listen to her. He was determined that his son would understand the price of his decision. Elias, gritting his teeth, looked his father directly in the eyes. The silence in the hall was deafening. Every person present held their breath, aware that what was happening was not just a family conflict, but a silent war for Elias's soul. "I don't need your money or your respect to be happy," Elias continued, his voice firmer. "I've realized that what you offer me is a golden cage." He turned to Camilla, taking her hand gently. "She offers me freedom. She is all I need to feel complete." Camilla, upon hearing those words, felt the tears threaten to fall from her eyes. Elias had always been her rock, but at that moment, as he faced his own father for her, she understood the true extent of the sacrifice he was making. The love he professed for her was not superficial or fleeting. It was a promise of a life and a future together, even if the circumstances were against them. Charles clenched his fists, clearly frustrated by his son's disobedience. Since Elias was a little boy, he had imagined a glorious future for him, full of success and power, controlling the family business and taking the name to new heights. But now all that effort seemed to be crumbling before his eyes because of a woman who, in his opinion, had nothing to offer. "You're making the mistake of your life," Charles snapped, looking at Elias as if he were a stranger. "This woman will lead you to ruin, and when that happens, don't expect us to lend you a hand." The cruelty of those words made Camilla lower her head, but Elias wasn't affected. He squeezed Camilla's hand tighter, determined not to let his father break the love they had built with so much effort. "Then I won't have to come back," Elias replied with serenity, although his heart was pounding. "If living with her means losing everything else, then I will accept it." Charles shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He took a step back, leaving the microphone, clearly defeated in his attempt to control the situation. The hall remained silent, but this time it wasn't because of the tension between father and son, but because of the astonishment of the guests at what they had just witnessed. It was rare to see someone like Elias so openly defy his powerful family. Finally, it was Susan who got up. She walked toward her son with her eyes filled with contradictory emotions. She had hoped that things wouldn't come to this point, but there was nothing she could do now. She stopped in front of him, looking at Camilla for a brief moment before turning back to her son. "Elias," she said softly with a contained sadness, "you know what this means for your future, don't you? You know we can't go on if you choose this path." Elias looked at her, knowing that those words came from a mother who loved him, but also from a woman trapped in a world of expectations and unbreakable rules. "I know, Mom," he replied in a softer tone. "But this is the future I want. Camilla is my family now." Susan nodded without saying anything else. She knew her son had already made his decision, and no matter how much it hurt, she wasn't going to fight anymore. She gave a sad look to her husband, who had already sat back down, defeated in his attempt to control the situation. When Susan returned to her seat, the ceremony continued, although the atmosphere was still charged with a tense and strange energy. Elias and Camilla exchanged vows, both aware that their path together would not be easy. But as they held hands and looked into each other's eyes, they knew that what they had shared, what they had sacrificed, was worth more than any fortune or inheritance. "I love you," Elias whispered as he placed the ring on her finger. His words were full of a promise for the future. Camilla, her eyes filled with tears, responded with a warm smile, one that made her feel that in spite of everything, they were in the right place. The ceremony ended with timid applause and a few murmurs. The guests knew that what they had just witnessed was more than a wedding. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of love that defied power and money. As Elias and Camilla walked out of the church together, hand in hand, they knew that even if the road ahead was full of difficulties, they had already won the most important battle. The battle to choose their own destiny, no matter the cost. And as they crossed the threshold, they realized that together, they could face anything. The first few months after the wedding were like a dream for Elias and Camilla. Despite everything they had left behind, they had each other, and that seemed to be enough. At first, the small apartment they rented in a modest neighborhood felt warm, full of love and hope. Camilla took care of decorating it simply, but with a personal touch that made every corner radiate her essence. Elias, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, looking for new opportunities to build a life with her, far from the shadows of his family. However, that peace was short-lived. The first signs came when Elias began to notice that doors that used to open easily for him were now closing in his face. Companies he had worked with in the past were no longer receiving him. Meetings that used to be automatic were now impossible to get. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, or perhaps the natural adjustment of having given up his family's support, but he soon realized that something more sinister was at play. One afternoon, after a failed meeting, Elias was left alone in a coffee shop, observing his reflection in the window. He felt defeated, as if the weight of the decision to confront his father was finally starting to take its toll. Then his phone rang. It was Hector, an old family friend who had also worked at his father's company. Hector's tone was solemn, almost compassionate. "Elias, I wanted to call you so you'd hear it from me, not someone else," Hector said, his voice low. "Your father has talked to everyone. He's made sure that no partner, no reputable company will offer you a job. He's made it clear that anyone who supports you or Camilla will be facing him." Elias felt his stomach sink. He knew his father was a powerful man, but he never imagined he would go this far. "Is he doing this for revenge?" Elias asked, although deep down he already knew the answer. Hector paused, as if he didn't know exactly what to say. "It's not just revenge. He wants you to come back, but on his terms. He says everything can be fixed if you leave Camilla and return to the family." Elias clenched his fist on the table, feeling an impotent rage rise in his throat. He knew his father saw everything as a power game, another strategy to control him. But this was not a business. It was his life, his marriage, his love for Camilla. "That's not going to happen, Hector. I won't leave Camilla," Elias replied, his voice trembling with contained anger. "No matter what he does." "I know, but be careful, Elias," Hector said in a graver tone. "He's bent on destroying any opportunity you have. And I think this is just the beginning." Elias hung up the phone feeling as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. He knew that confronting his father would have consequences, but he never imagined it would go this far. Elias, a man used to forging his own destiny, realized that he was trapped in a web he couldn't control. He knew his father had the power to erase his reputation in the business world, and that was starting to destroy his chances of providing for his home. When he got home that night, Camilla was waiting for him, as always, with a warm, worried smile. But that night, Camilla's smile wasn't enough to lift Elias's spirits. He sat on the sofa without saying a word, his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost. "What happened, Elias?" Camilla asked softly, sitting down next to him. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in a long time he didn't know what to say. He knew she had felt the tension, that money was starting to run low, and that opportunities were disappearing. But telling her that it was all part of his father's plan made him feel even more helpless. "My father has made sure I can't work anywhere he has influence," he finally said, his voice flat. Camilla looked at him in silence for a moment, absorbing what that meant. She knew Charles was capable of many things, but it was still hard for her to accept that someone could do something so cruel, even to his own son. "And what does he want?" Camilla asked, even though she already knew the answer. "He wants me to leave you. He wants me to go back and do things his way, as always." Elias let out a bitter sigh. "He says if I leave you, he'll give me everything back, that I can have the life he always wanted for me." Camilla felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she had wondered if their love was destroying Elias's life. She knew he had lost everything to be with her, and although he had never said it, she feared that at some point, that burden would be too much for him. But when their eyes met, she saw the same determination in Elias's eyes that had won her over from the beginning. "Elias, I can't ask you to keep losing everything for me," Camilla said, her voice a thread. Elias looked at her, surprised that she would even think that. He took her hand tightly, as if he feared that his father's words could separate her from him. "You're not asking me. I chose this. I chose you, and I would do it 1,000 times over." His voice cracked, but his gaze was firm. "I'm not going to let him win. I'm not going to leave you." Camilla felt the tears fall down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the love and strength that Elias was showing her in that moment. But they both knew that the path they were on was uncertain, and that the shadow of Charles would not stop pursuing them. The following weeks were even harder. Money started to run out, and with every door that closed, Elias felt more helpless. He looked for work wherever he could, but the rumors had already spread. Elias, the rebellious son, is blacklisted. Even in places where his family had no direct influence, his name had become a synonym for trouble. Camilla tried to contribute what she could, but her skills and connections were not enough to keep them afloat. One day, as Elias sat in their small kitchen going over the few job options he had left, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Hector, it was his father. "You know this doesn't have to be this way, Elias?" Charles said, his voice soft but filled with that cold authority he had always held over him. "Everything can go back to how it was. You just have to make the right decision." Elias squeezed the phone. Rage was boiling inside him, but he tried to stay calm. "The right decision according to you, Dad, not according to what I feel. I won't leave Camilla." Charles paused as if he were evaluating the situation before continuing. "Very well, then let's continue with this game. Let's see how much more you can endure with nothing. When you run out of options, you'll know where to find me." Elias hung up the phone, feeling more defeated than ever. He knew his father wasn't going to give in, but he wouldn't either. However, the weight of the situation was starting to crush him. Camilla entered the kitchen at that moment, seeing the expression on Elias's face. "It was your father, wasn't it?" she asked with a mix of concern and resignation. Elias nodded, unable to speak, and got up to hug her tightly. Camilla snuggled into his chest, and in that moment they both understood that what was at stake was not just their love, but their ability to resist an implacable power that was trying to separate them. But as Elias gently stroked Camilla's hair, he realized something. His father could take everything away from him, except the most important thing. Time continued to pass, and the difficulties seemed to multiply for Elias and Camilla. Money was scarcer than ever, and job opportunities for Elias were disappearing at an implacable rate. But in the midst of that storm came news that would change their lives forever. One afternoon, while Elias was out looking for work, Camilla sat in the small bathroom of their apartment, holding a pregnancy test in her hands. Her heart was pounding. The result was clear. She was pregnant. Mixed feelings swirled inside her. On one hand, the immense joy of knowing she was going to become a mother, but on the other, the fear of what that would mean amidst the difficulties they were already facing. When Elias got home, exhausted and with a tired look on his face after another unsuccessful day, he found Camilla sitting on the sofa with her eyes full of tears, but this time not from sadness. Not knowing what was wrong, Elias quickly approached her, worried. "What's wrong, love?" he asked, kneeling in front of her. Camilla took his hands and gave him a small smile between tears. "I'm pregnant, Elias." For a moment, Elias's world seemed to stop. His mind tried to process what he had just heard. A child. A baby. Despite all the chaos surrounding their lives, that news filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, a smile formed on his face and tears began to fill his eyes too. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're going to be parents." Camilla nodded, and at that moment, Elias hugged them both tightly, letting the tears of joy fall freely. For the first time in months, there was a ray of hope in the midst of so much darkness. A child. That little being they didn't even know, yet was giving them a new reason to fight. However, reality soon set in. With the baby's arrival, their needs would multiply, and they knew they had to find a way to get ahead and fast. It was then that Camilla remembered one of the few talents she had always enjoyed, making cakes. Camilla had learned to make cakes from a young age with her mother in their modest home's kitchen. It was something that made her happy, and that had surprised those who tasted them on more than one occasion. At that moment, she thought that perhaps that skill could be the answer they were looking for. "I've been thinking," Camilla said one night while they were having dinner. "I could start selling cakes. I know it's not much, but if we do it online, maybe we can earn some money." Elias looked at her with interest. He knew Camilla's cakes were incredible, but it hadn't occurred to him that they could sell them as a source of income. "Do you think so?" he asked, even though he could already imagine the idea's potential. "I could help you with deliveries, and we can create a page to promote them." Camilla nodded enthusiastically, happy that he agreed. That night, they stayed up late designing a plan. Elias, with his basic knowledge of technology, created a simple social media page where they could post photos of the cakes Camilla would start preparing. She, for her part, began experimenting with new recipes and decorations, wanting to offer something special. The first few weeks were slow. They sold a couple of cakes here and there, delivering them to local customers who found their page. Elias took care of the deliveries on a bicycle, as they couldn't afford a car. At first, it wasn't much, but every time he returned from a delivery, he brought back a smile. "People love your cakes," Elias would say excitedly. "Today, someone told me they're the best they've ever tasted." Camilla, despite the fatigue from the pregnancy and the long hours in the kitchen, felt that they were finally finding a way to get ahead. With each order, her confidence grew. The small kitchen in their apartment had become a makeshift bakery with flour and sugar scattered everywhere and the sweet aroma of cakes filling every corner. One day, while Elias was making a delivery to a regular customer, a man in a suit waiting at the entrance of a large building caught his attention. The man, who seemed to be watching the box of cakes Elias was holding with interest, approached him curiously. "Are those your cakes?" the man asked with a friendly smile. "They're my wife's," Elias replied with the same friendliness. "I just do the deliveries." The man nodded, looking at the box carefully. "I work for a coffee shop chain," he said, introducing himself as Robert, a manager for a major local food company. "We're looking for something different to offer in our shops, and your cakes have a great presentation. Would you mind if we tasted them at our main cafe? If we like them, we could make a deal for you to supply us regularly." Elias was speechless for a moment. It was a real opportunity. After everything they had been through, could this be the turnaround they so desperately needed? "Of course," he finally replied, feeling the adrenaline in his body. "I can bring a bigger sample next week." When Elias got home that afternoon, he could barely contain his excitement. "Camilla, you're not going to believe what happened," he said, rushing into the apartment. "A manager from a coffee shop chain wants to try your cakes. It could be a huge opportunity." Camilla looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" she asked as if she couldn't believe it. Elias nodded, hugging her tightly. "We're going to do it, Camilla. This could be what we've been waiting for." That night, as Elias and Camilla hugged in the small bed they shared, they felt more optimistic than they had in months. They knew the road would still be difficult, but now there was a possibility, a spark of hope that wasn't there before, and above all, they were doing it together. The following week, Camilla prepared her best cakes, and Elias made sure the delivery was impeccable. They took them to the chain's main cafe, and Robert, the manager, was impressed by both the quality of the product and the story behind them. A couple of days later, they received the call that would change their lives. "We love your cakes," Robert said. "We want to sign a contract for you to supply us weekly." Elias and Camilla couldn't believe it. For the first time, after so much struggle and sacrifice, there was a real opportunity to get ahead. They were starting to build something of their own, something that no one, not even Charles, could take away from them. As Camilla stroked her now more noticeable belly, and Elias watched her with a smile full of love and pride, they knew that despite all the difficulties, they had won the most important battle. The one to stay together, facing everything life threw at them, and now with the hope of a better future for themselves and their child. The months that followed the contract with the coffee shop chain brought a significant change in Elias and Camilla's lives. Little by little, orders increased, and what began as a small venture to survive turned into a growing business. Camilla, with her increasingly prominent belly, spent long hours in the kitchen creating new recipes and making sure every cake was perfect. Meanwhile, Elias, always willing to help, took care of deliveries, logistics, and began managing the accounts and contracts that came in thanks to the growing popularity of the cakes. However, success did not come without its own challenges. The work was becoming exhausting for Camilla, and her pregnancy in its last trimester left her with no energy as the days went on. One afternoon, while she was bent over the counter decorating a cake for a new delivery, she felt a sharp pain in her back that forced her to stop. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the pain wouldn't subside. Elias came in at that moment with a large box of supplies in his hands and, seeing the expression on Camilla's face, immediately put everything aside. "Are you okay?" he asked, approaching her quickly. Camilla looked at him with a weak smile, trying to downplay it. "I'm fine, the baby is just restless today," she replied, although the discomfort was evident. Elias watched her with concern. He knew that even though Camilla was incredibly strong, they couldn't ignore the fact that her body needed rest. He knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "Camilla, you should rest a little. You've been working too hard," he said with tenderness but also firmness. She shook her head softly. "We have so many orders, Elias. We can't stop now. This is what's getting us ahead." Elias caressed her cheek, his face reflecting the mix of love and worry he felt. "I know, but your health and the babies are more important than any cake. Let me take care of the rest for today. Please rest." Camilla finally nodded, realizing she couldn't keep ignoring her body's signals. Elias guided her to the sofa and helped her sit comfortably. Then he went back to the kitchen, determined to finish the order himself. That night, while Camilla rested, Elias reviewed the finances and the upcoming orders. The business was growing faster than they had anticipated, and although that was a reason to be happy, it also meant they had to find a way to handle the workload. Hiring help would be the most sensible thing to do, but they were still recovering financially and couldn't afford a large expense. The next morning, as they had breakfast together, Camilla took her cup of tea and looked at Elias thoughtfully. "I've been thinking, maybe we should look for a small storefront," she said, surprising Elias. "A storefront?" he asked, looking up from the newspaper. "Don't you think it's a little too soon for that?" Camilla smiled, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "It's not too soon. If we keep growing at this rate, we'll need more space. Besides, if we have our own place, we could hire someone to help me in the kitchen. We can't keep working only from the apartment, not when the baby gets here." Elias was pensive for a moment. The idea of having their own storefront had always been a dream, but the circumstances of the last few months had kept him focused only on surviving. However, hearing Camilla talk with such hope, he knew that dream was closer than they thought. "You're right," he finally said with a smile. "Let's start looking. It won't be easy, but if we find the right place, we can take the next step." Camilla returned his smile, feeling immense relief. Although the journey so far had been difficult, there was now a new horizon full of possibilities. The following weeks were filled with excitement and nervousness. Elias took care of the deliveries and continued looking for possible storefronts, while Camilla, despite her advanced pregnancy, continued to manage orders from home with the occasional help of a neighbor who offered to pitch in. Finally, one day after weeks of searching, they found a small storefront in the city center, right next to a popular coffee shop. It was modest, but it had everything they needed: a spacious kitchen, a customer service area, and a display window that could attract passers-by. The rent was fair, and with a little effort, they knew they could turn it into something special. "This is the place," Camilla said, excited as she walked through the empty space, imagining how they would decorate it and how it would look full of fresh cakes. "I can see it all, Elias. It will be our home away from home." Elias watched her, feeling a mix of pride and love. Despite everything they had been through, they were building something of their own, something no one could take away from them. "We'll make it happen," Elias promised, taking her hand. "This will be our next step." With the contract signed and the keys in hand, they began the renovations. It was a slow process, as they were still managing orders while also preparing the storefront for the opening. But with each passing day, the place was transformed, and so were their lives. One afternoon, while they were painting the walls of the new storefront, Camilla stopped with her hand on her belly. "I think the baby is excited too," she said with a smile. "She's moving a lot today." Elias quickly approached her, placing his hand on Camilla's belly, feeling the small movements. "She's going to be a great baker. I can already tell," he joked, his eyes full of love. Camilla laughed, but her laughter was interrupted by a small groan of pain. Elias looked at her, concerned. "Are you okay?" She nodded, although the pain was evident. "I think the baby is just getting comfortable, but maybe we should go home and rest." Elias didn't hesitate. He knew that the last few weeks had been exhausting for both of them, but especially for Camilla. They put down their tools and went home, knowing that even though there was a lot to do, the most important thing was Camilla's and the baby's health. The business was underway, the plans were moving forward, and the future was beginning to take shape. Every day, despite the challenges, Camilla and Elias felt closer to fulfilling their dreams. They knew the path hadn't been easy, but they also knew they had walked it together, and that made them invincible. And even though the problems and the shadows of the past were still present, the success they were building with their own hands was the best testimony that love and perseverance could overcome even the highest barriers. Elias and Camilla had been working nonstop to finish the details of their new storefront. The inauguration day was approaching, and although both were exhausted from the long days of work, there was a mix of excitement and nervousness in the air. The dream of having their own business was about to become a reality, but the pressure of everything going well was starting to weigh on them, especially with the baby so close to arriving. One morning, while Camilla was finishing arranging the display cases of the new storefront, she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. At first, she thought it was just another discomfort of pregnancy, but this time the pain was stronger, and a feeling of unease came over her. She stopped, breathing deeply and leaning her hands on the counter, waiting for the pain to pass. Elias, who was outside going over some papers, came in at that moment and saw her bent over, her face tense with pain. "Camilla?" he asked worriedly, approaching her quickly. "What's wrong?" She tried to smile to reassure him, but the pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think the baby is ready to arrive," she said, her voice trembling. Elias felt fear and emotion flood him at the same time. He knew the time was near, but he didn't expect it to be so soon. "We have to go to the hospital," he said urgently, grabbing the keys and helping Camilla stand up carefully. The trip to the hospital was a mix of tension and excitement. Camilla breathed slowly, trying to stay calm, while Elias drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding hers. Every now and then he would look at her, trying to make sure she was okay, even though the latent fear in his chest made him feel helpless. When they arrived at the hospital, they were quickly received by the staff, and Camilla was taken to the delivery room. Elias, although nervous, stayed by her side at all times. The hours that followed were long and exhausting. Elias had never felt such an intense combination of fear and emotion. As he held Camilla's hand, he saw the effort and pain on her face, but also the incredible strength she was showing in that moment. The admiration he felt for his wife grew with every second. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, a baby's cry broke the tense silence of the room. Elias and Camilla looked at each other with eyes full of tears of happiness and relief. The doctor held up the baby, and as he placed her on Camilla's chest, the room filled with a peace they hadn't felt in months. "It's a girl," Elias whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Camilla, exhausted but radiant, looked at her daughter with tenderness. She stroked the baby's soft skin, whispering words of love as tears rolled down her cheeks. Elias leaned in, hugging them both, and for a moment, the entire outside world disappeared. They were a family. Hours later, when Camilla was resting with the baby in her arms, Elias left the room to get some air. Despite the joy he felt, he knew that work was still waiting. The storefront was almost ready for the inauguration, but there were still some details to be sorted out. As he looked out the hospital window, he thought about his father, about everything he had left behind, and how fate had led them to this moment. The fight with his family, the closed doors, the daily struggles. It had all been worth it to get to where they were now. However, his father's shadow was still present, although distant. He knew that Charles had tried everything to make their lives miserable, But what he hadn't been able to foresee was that the love he shared with Camilla was much stronger than any influence or power his father could exert. But the doubt remained. Was he truly free from his family? A few days after the birth of their daughter, whom they named Sophia, the inauguration of the storefront finally arrived. Camilla, still recovering, took care of supervising the final details from a distance, while Elias and some close friends helped prepare everything. There were balloons, flowers, and a simple but meaningful sign at the entrance: Sophia's Sweets. The opening day was a success. The neighbors from the neighborhood, regular customers who had tasted the cakes before, and some new curious people came into the small storefront, attracted by the delicious aroma and the cozy atmosphere. Elias and Camilla couldn't believe it. After months of sacrifice, hard work, and obstacles, their dream had finally become a reality. However, in the midst of the joy and the bustle of the inauguration, Elias noticed a familiar figure among the customers who were coming in. Charles, his father, had arrived. Elias felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't know what to expect from him. They hadn't had contact in months, and the last time they talked, things didn't end well. Charles, dressed in his impeccable suit, approached the counter slowly, where Elias was waiting with a serious look on his face. "Elias," Charles said in a voice that seemed less authoritative than usual. "I wanted to see how you were doing." Elias looked at him, not knowing if his father came with good intentions, or if it was just another strategy to make him feel like he had failed. "We're doing well, Dad," Elias replied calmly, although inside his emotions were stirred up. "I don't need your approval." Charles watched him for a moment, and in his eyes, for the first time, Elias saw something he didn't expect: weariness. His father, the man who had always been the figure of unyielding power, seemed older, more vulnerable. "I didn't come for that," Charles said, taking a deep breath. "I came because I've been thinking. Maybe I was wrong. I didn't expect you to go this far, and we—" Elias didn't know what to say. His father's words left him stunned. For so long, he had fought to prove that he could do it alone, without depending on the family fortune. And now, in front of him, his father seemed willing to admit it. "Don't get me wrong, Elias," Charles continued. "I still believe this isn't the path you should have taken." But his voice softened. Something I had never heard in him. "I can't ignore what you've accomplished. I came to congratulate you in spite of everything." Elias, still in a state of shock, nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, not knowing what else to say. Charles stayed for a few more seconds, as if he wanted to say something else, but in the end, he turned and left the storefront without looking back. Elias watched him go, and a feeling of relief mixed with confusion came over him. Maybe it wasn't the end of his problems with his father, but at least for the first time, there was a glimmer of reconciliation, however small. When Elias returned to Camilla's side, she smiled at him, holding Sophia in her arms. "What happened?" she asked, noticing the expression on his face. "My father came to congratulate us," Elias replied, still in disbelief. Camilla looked at him, surprised, but didn't say anything else. She just extended her hand to him, and as he took his small daughter into his arms, he knew that no matter what happened, nothing could separate them now. They had built something real, something of their own. The morning sun entered gently through the windows of the small cake shop, illuminating the display cases filled with delicious creations that had made Sophia's Sweets a success in the city. It was a normal day, but for Elias and Camilla, every day in that space was a reminder of everything they had accomplished together against all odds. Sophia, who was now a few months old, was in a makeshift crib in the back of the storefront, laughing as she played with a small plush toy. Camilla, with a look of love and serenity, worked in the kitchen, carefully decorating a special cake for a frequent customer. Elias was at the counter, serving customers with a smile that reflected more than just business satisfaction. It reflected peace, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. After everything they had been through, from his father's threats to the moments of despair, when it seemed like nothing would work, they had reached this point. They looked at each other and smiled, knowing that the most important thing wasn't the business's success, but the fact that they had built something real, something no one could take away from them. A family, a home, and a future full of promises. That afternoon, as the flow of customers began to decrease, Camilla sat down next to Elias, stroking Sophia's small hand, which was sleeping peacefully. "Do you remember the first few days?" Camilla asked with a nostalgic smile. "Everything seemed so uncertain. And now look where we are." Elias nodded, clearly remembering those days filled with uncertainty. They had had so many doubts, so many sleepless nights wondering if they could really do it. But he also remembered the small victories, the moments when they had felt they were moving forward, even when everything seemed to be against them. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it," Elias replied, taking Camilla's hand. "Every sacrifice, every obstacle, it all brought us here." Camilla looked at him, seeing in his eyes the same strength and determination that had won her over from the beginning. Despite everything they had lost by defying his family, she never regretted her choice. She had chosen love, and that love had sustained them in the darkest moments. "Sometimes I think about how things would have been if we had given in," Camilla said with a touch of reflection in her voice. "If you had done what your father wanted, if I had let the pressure separate us." Elias gently shook his head. "We can't live thinking about what could have been. Everything we've been through has brought us here, and I wouldn't change anything about what we have. Look at Sophia," he said, pointing to their little daughter. "She's the proof that every decision we made was the right one." The silence that followed was one of peace, of a deep understanding between them. They knew their path hadn't been the easiest, but it had been their own, the one they chose together. Suddenly, the storefront door opened softly, and they both looked up to see Charles, Elias's father, enter with a slow step. The tension that would have been palpable in his presence before was no longer there. On his face, you could see that something had changed in him as well. He wasn't the same man who had tried to control his son's life, to impose his desires on him. Charles approached the counter, looking around the storefront. His eyes stopped on Sophia, who was still sleeping peacefully. "She's beautiful," Charles said in a low voice, breaking the silence. "She looks like her mother." Elias exchanged a quick glance with Camilla before nodding. He knew his father's words weren't just a compliment. They were an acknowledgement, something he had never expected to hear. "Thank you, Dad," Elias said, approaching him. Charles took a deep breath, as if he was struggling with something he had held on to for a long time. He finally let it go. "I was wrong, Elias. I was wrong about so many things," he said with a tone of vulnerability he had never shown before. "I thought what I was offering you was what was best for you, but I was blinded by my own pride. Seeing what you've built here, your family, this business, it makes me realize that money or power aren't always the most important things." Elias felt a heavy weight lift from his chest. He had waited so long to hear those words, and although he didn't believe everything could be fixed immediately, it was a step towards something better. "All I ever wanted was to be happy with Camilla and my daughter," Elias replied, his voice soft but full of conviction. "I wanted you to see that, to understand." Charles nodded slowly, looking at his son with a mixture of regret and respect. "I see it now, and I regret putting you in the position I did. I'm not here to ask you for anything, only to tell you that I'm proud of what you've accomplished." Elias felt tears well up in his eyes, but he swallowed them, staying firm. He extended his hand to his father, who, after a second of hesitation, took it. The gesture, although simple, was the beginning of something new. Camilla, watching the scene, felt a peace she hadn't felt before. She knew that Elias had carried the weight of his father's disapproval for so long, and seeing that reconciliation, even if it was small, was a necessary closure for both of them. After Charles left, the storefront was filled with silence again, but this time it was a silence full of hope. There was a new beginning, not just for Elias and Camilla, but also for the relationship with the family he had left behind. "Do you think things will change from now on?" Camilla asked as she held Sophia in her arms. Elias looked at her, reflecting for a moment. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But the important thing is that we're okay, and that won't change. Everything else will come with time." Camilla smiled, resting her head on Elias's shoulder as they watched the sunset through the window. They had started with nothing, facing the greatest adversity they could imagine. But they had triumphed, not because they sought wealth or success, but because they had done it together, out of love and mutual trust. And in that moment, as they held their daughter and sat in their small business, they knew that true success was not material but the family they had built. A family that, against all odds, flourished, proving that love and perseverance can conquer even the greatest challenges. The future was uncertain, but Elias and Camilla knew that no matter what happened, they would move forward always together. And that was the greatest victory of all.